We are continuing to make powerful strides through War and Peace, and we will very soon be approaching the last quarter of the book. And I said early on, when we first began reading, that once you're into the world that Tolstoy has gifted us, the difficulty will not be in getting through it, but the difficulty will come in putting it down. And indeed, to me, War and Peace is one of those books that we wish went on longer, yeah? We're going to be sad when it's over. And so keeping that in mind, my imploration to you is to enjoy every moment, enjoy every episode. And I have a strong feeling that there will be some Tolstoic remnants in our psyche once we have finished. We will not be able to stop thinking about this book, and many of us will want to return to it and reread it endlessly over the course of our lives. In today's discussion, we're going to see where Tolstoy really gets his moralizing reputation, because we're going to breach some of his historical writings, the little episodes where he takes a step back and is incredibly overt. He's already given us many philosophical musings on history, but now he's going to give it to us directly. Tolstoy, the omniscient 19th century writer, is going to intrude in a significant way, and it makes a really interesting effect because we move back and forward from overt narration and episodes that feel like a blend of historical record and philosophical musing. And we move between that realm and the fictional realm, the realm of imaginative literature, and it creates a very estranging effect. Regardless of that, I feel as though those episodes work to great effect, and it's part of Tolstoy's unity. And talking about the characters, it's always about the characters for me. War and Peace. As Nabokov said about Anna Karenina, old Russians will talk about the characters. They'll talk about Stiva and Anna and Dolly and Kitty and Vronsky as though they were indeed old friends and acquaintances. And I think we are feeling that with War and Peace too. And indeed, we talk about befriending the characters in imaginative literature a lot. Befriend the characters, become at home in their world, take their concerns on as though they were your own. But it's interesting to consider a couple of things. Firstly, the fictional characters feel much more real in War and Peace than the historical personages, don't they? We see, in the section that we're going to discuss today, Napoleon becomes more of a protagonist. We spend more time with Napoleon, but he doesn't quite feel real. There's something strange going on with his representation. Not real like the fictional characters like Pierre and Andrei and Natasha. Characters who, as again Lydia Ginsburg marvellously put it, have an auto-psychological aspect. They are manifestations of Tolstoy and people he knew and loved in his own life. So it's interesting because it certainly feels as though we are able to befriend these characters, but ultimately they are words on a page, ink on a page, and we convert that ink to pictures in our mind, and it feels as though we are experiencing everything that happened in the novel, and we reflect back over our reading, and it feels like memory, doesn't it? But what do we mean by friendship? Well, Aristotle thought that the highest form of friendship was not a relationship where you seek to derive a simple value exchange from one another. What can I get out of you? The highest form of friendship is when you want to see the betterment of another who is essentially you. You sympathise with them and your concerns converge, so their well-being becomes part of your concern, and vice versa. So you want to see them improve. You feel that they have the ability to improve and they are a reflection of yourself. And it's worth keeping that just running in the background of your mind and meditating upon whenever you think about these characters as real friends. We want to see them succeed, we want to see them improve, and if we feel as though we do not like them at times, or we scorn some of their decisions and their behaviours, we might consider that it's because they are reflections of us and we think that they can do better. And so if we think that they can do better, then ultimately we are championing ourselves. Now let's talk about Natasha, Andrei and Pierre. Let's talk about these characters as a trio because we are seeing that they are inextricably linked, aren't they? And we see that Pierre is becoming increasingly psychically, emotionally, spiritually linked with Natasha. Yeah? We are also seeing Natasha's character develop. Natasha's one of those characters that grows on us as she grows, and we might not initially like her in much the same way that we probably initially didn't like Pierre and then we love him, and similar to Andrei, we understand him and forgive him. When it comes to writing, it feels like great writers are tightrope walking because they want to give us psychologically complex characters, which means they have to be flawed, but they don't want to make the characters so despicable that we stop reading, that we cannot go on reading, so they have to layer in many other aspects, beautiful narrative, profound themes, and constant conflict. Yeah, story is conflict. A character wants something, a character needs something, and these two might also conflict. What we say we want or ostensibly want may be different from what we truly need, and so that's inner conflict. But then somebody wants something, but the world around them is exerting its influence upon them because there are many different variables and wills clashing up against one another in this world. And so what they want or what they need, there is an obstacle there. And so great story is vicariously experiencing that overcoming of obstacles with characters who are reflections of us and who we learn to love. And so Natasha's character is developing, and by that we mean she is maturing. Tolstoy gives us the maturation process of individuals like no other writer I can personally think of. And we get a sense of separation and homing, don't we? Separation, yes, when Andrei is apart from Natasha, actually physically apart, but there is a separation even upon his return. So in the return there's a separation. So we're thinking about binaries again, how everything contains its contrary. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. So his return is a split, it's another separation. And we see that this return is a separation because Natasha essentially ruins their relationship so close to their moment of reunion. Now, I say ruin with quotation marks because it's not really her fault. I don't think it's really her fault. And we have this idea of the ruined woman constantly coming through. Tolstoy is keen to constantly examine this idea. He's preoccupied with it. Interestingly, Rosamund Bartlett, in her tremendous biography, said that Tolstoy would come out of his study when he was writing Anna Karenina, shaking his head about what Anna had done recently in the latest instalment of the work. And though he might have been critical of his heroine, I think it's undeniable that there is a huge heaping of Tolstoy in her, as is the case with all of his characters. We might think that rather like Flaubert, who said of Emma Bovary, c'est moi, we might think that Tolstoy self-identified. But remember that discussion we had about homing and sympathy and striving in nature. We feel that with Pierre and Natasha. Chapter 19, page 651 in the Briggs, we're told that Pierre had been avoiding Natasha. He could sense that his feelings towards her were stronger than they ought to be between a married man and a young girl engaged to one of his friends. But somehow fate kept bringing them together. So we see that sympathy, we see that striving, that homing, but these characters still have a lot to learn and they still have a lot of growth to come. And growth means experience and it means pain. Now, I've said that I don't think it's really Natasha's fault, but does that mean it's Andrei's fault? I mean, after all, he imposed the game, the little test, didn't he? The waiting period. It was his father's idea, but he accepted it and he imposed it. Is it his fault? Is it Anatole's fault? Anatole quite deliberately manipulated Natasha's feelings. He knew what he was doing, and to him it was a little bit of fun, a little bit of sport. We also get a sense, a very strong sense, that he doesn't feel guilty about it. And so we're seeking to assign blame, which is an interesting impulse when we consider two things. One of the grand themes of War and Peace is, of course, fate, free will, culpability, causation. They're all linked, yeah? We'll be seeing Tolstoy talk about causation in regards to history, but it works on the micro level and the macro level. It's all interlinked. There are so many variables involved when it comes to history and when it comes to our lives and when it comes to the things that happen. Because there are so many variables involved, can a single blame, a single cause be assigned? And two, Tolstoy's characters are incredibly nuanced and we understand them. And understanding can mean forgiveness, not always, but it certainly can mean forgiveness. So that understanding further emphasizes Tolstoy's idea of there not being a single cause. And blaming can look very reductive, it can look like black and white thinking, and it can be out of line with reality and how things really go. So we see that Natasha is still young, she's not matured, and she is easily swayed. We see that Anatole is reprehensible, very much like his sister, and I feel as though the ludicrous abduction scene or the abduction attempt, the machinations, the planning, the scheming, I feel like all of that is straight out of a tawdry, bodice-ripping romance yarn. Indeed, it makes me think of Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. Tolstoy, of course, would have known something of Samuel Richardson's writings, and he would have known something of Jane Austen's writings, and we see the influence. In fact, we can see a line that goes rather like this: Shakespeare, Richardson, Jane Austen, Tolstoy. Now there's a lot more to it, but we can mark a path of influence down the ages through the writers, and indeed writers are influenced directly, but also most significantly indirectly, whether they like it or not. We see that Natasha is swayed, but she's not a bad person, and she is, even at this moment where we could say she's not self-aware, we do see self-awareness. So she's innocent, she's naive, but we do see this probing, this introspection and reflection and this relentless questioning. She questions her inner yearnings and she seems self-aware. Innocent is not the same as being unaware, and she is capable of contemplation. She's a psychologically complex character, and yes, she seems to be constantly looking in the mirror, but she's actually trying to pierce deeper, probe beneath her own surface. And Tolstoy in War and Peace is a writer of relentless movement. There's constant movement like a machine, and we see that there is relentless movement in Natasha's interiority. Now let's compare a couple of passages and try to discern some of that movement. And a little marginalia tip, this is what I do. When I note movement, or if I note that two passages that are a fair distance apart from one another deal with the same themes, what I'll do is I'll put the page number for the comparison, for the complementary passage, I'll put it in the corresponding paragraph. And then I'll go to the corresponding paragraph and I'll put the page number. So there's a reference back and forth, and it makes it very easy to flip between them and, rather like scientific slides, hold them up and examine the specimen inside. Volume 2, Part 5, Chapter 8. This is page 614 in the Briggs. Natasha is looking in the mirror, a big mirror, and she saw that she looked pretty, very pretty, which made her feel even sadder than before, though it was a sweet and tender sadness. So she's not merely admiring her physicality, her outward, her exterior. Yes, that's there, but it's only leverage to deeper probing, deeper thoughts, and her own image prompts her to say to herself, "Oh God, if only he was here with me now, I wouldn't be like I used to be. Silly and shy, I'd be quite different. I'd give him a hug, cuddle up to him, and force him to look at me with those searching, questioning eyes, the way he used to look at me before. And then I'd make him laugh, the way he used to laugh, and his eyes, oh, I can see those eyes," thought Natasha. And let's compare that to the end of chapter 10 in the same part, page 624. She's now wondering to herself, am I finished with Prince Andrei's love or not? Silly girl, asking things like that. What's happened to me? Nothing. I haven't done anything. I didn't ask for this. No one will ever know and I shan't see him again, she told herself. So she's talking about Anatole to herself, yeah? We can see that there has been an incredible change in her interiority, in her self-talk. And she's trying to comfort herself and say, this is clear. Nothing's happened. There's nothing to apologise for. Prince Andrei can love me for what I am. But am I really what I am? Oh God, why isn't he here? We're told that Natasha's consolation was short-lived. Once again, in her imagination, she ran through her conversation with Kuragin, and she could still see his features, his every gesture, and the kind of smile on the face of a brave, handsome man squeezing her arm. So what's happened in the interim to prompt such extremely different introspections? Well, she's still waiting for Andrei to return, and she goes to the opera. And the opera in Tolstoy is a place to be gazed upon. It's a place to be judged, and the real story isn't what's happening on stage, it's what's happening in the audience, and we see that. And it's an arena, very much like the ballrooms and the salons, where young girls could be brought out to find their match. So at this time, the number one question on a young girl's mind, and most certainly the number one question on her mother's mind, wasn't sweeping philosophy about meaning, the meaning of life, politics, economics, nationality, what's happening across Europe. The concern at this time was, how does a young girl, a girl of quality, and if you were a young woman of quality, then it meant that you came from the landed class and you had money. That was the most important thing, the size of one's dowry, and it was a bonus if one was physically attractive too, but certainly not a prerequisite. Young girls would be brought out into society and they would experience a couple of seasons of balls, and the aim was to meet a quality husband, a high-ranking husband. The richest girls were the ones who met their matches most swiftly, and then it would be the pretty girls. And all of this was very much dependent on the wealth of one's father. And so some of the high society scenes where the characters are saying, your destiny is in my hands, this is your destiny, all hinges on this moment. Well, most certainly, if we want to talk about free will and think about how much we have, we can certainly see that one's birth alone, where one was born, the circumstances into which one was randomly thrown, would weigh so heavily on one's future. It would exert such an incredible influence. And so what Andrei has done, he's left his betrothed, he's left his young love for a year, which at this formative age is, it might as well be a lifetime. So much can happen in a year. We know this. Even if we ourselves are not in a particularly formative age, we know how much can happen in a year alone. But he's left her for a year. She's out in high society and she is rubbing up against people who aren't there in the arena with the best of intentions, and she sees Anatole and she's young and impressionable and easily swayed, and we get this fantastic scene where it's almost like Anatole's entrance and his movements and his arrival on stage line up with the arrival of a devil on stage. And so this devilish music plays, and that's kind of like Anatole's motif. So there's a little bit of comedy there, there's a little bit of symbolism, and it's all very overt. And of course we know that Anatole does not have the best of intentions. Pierre and Dolokhov know his secret, which is that he is already married. And so his plan with Natasha would be highly illegal, bigamous. And so we see Natasha's at a formative age where her questioning should all be essentially around who's she going to marry, yeah? Is she going to be able to find a match? She doesn't want to be waiting too long, but of course she is already technically betrothed to Andrei. And we see that this chain of events prompts her to ask questions about who she is, what she is. We have that brilliant line, Prince Andrei can love me for what I am, but am I really what I am? So she doesn't really know who she is, and at this age we are still developing. But that question is masterful. As Colin Wilson says in talking about Tolstoy and also Dostoevsky, talking about the golden age of Russian literature, he said that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, by the way, were both explainers rather than describers when it came to their aesthetics. Colin Wilson said that Tolstoy was the first novelist to ask in so many words, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of human existence. And certainly we might think that the purpose of human existence isn't ballroom flattery and marrying for wealth. We also see this struggle play out with Boris, as we see Boris confronted with the dilemma of marrying for wealth versus marrying for love. And there's great commentary, great social satire in Boris's flip-flopping. Yeah, he can't make up his mind. He's being incredibly fickle, variable, and inconstant. He flip-flops, and then he launches forth into this diatribe about feminine fickleness. That is pure Austen, pure Shakespeare. Chapter 6, Volume 2, Part 5, page 607, we see that Julie welcomes him with a breezy cheerfulness, just happening to mention how much she had enjoyed yesterday evening's ball, and she asked when he was leaving. Although Boris had come with every intention of declaring his love, and therefore speaking tenderly, he launched forth irritably on the subject of feminine fickleness, observing how women could switch so easily from sadness to joy, and how their mood depended entirely on who happened to be running after them. Julie took offence at this and said yes, it was perfectly true that a woman needed variety, and anyone would get bored if nothing ever changed. And Boris is forced to make a decision. He says to himself, well, I can always arrange not to see much of her. In for a penny, in for a pound. He blushed to the roots of his hair, gazed into her face and said, you know how I feel about you. That was enough. Julie was beaming with triumph and self-congratulation, but she still made Boris go through everything that is normally said on these occasions. That he was in love with her, and had never loved any woman like this. You know that a writer is really masterful when it comes to crafting characters when you can discern that a character talking to another is actually talking to themselves. And that's really masterful stuff. As we go through literature, we'll see that different writers work primarily in different modes. Shakespeare's characters are able to hear themselves, they are able to introspect and reflect, but they don't really hear other people. Cervantes' characters, the knight-errant and squire, now they do hear each other. Tolstoy's characters are a mixture. I think Tolstoy's characters are a little bit more solipsistic. Yeah, they're narcissistic. Be on the lookout and see if you can note where they actually do take notice of what another character says. They do, and very often it comes a little bit too late, or it comes after the fact, or it's tied up with their contemplation of, say, the natural world, which is yet again a reflection of themselves. But it's interesting. We can see that all talk is self-talk. We see with Maria that she finds herself in other people. She's devoted to her father, but as he becomes increasingly difficult to put up with in his old age, she also starts to note her father in herself. And that's really interesting. And another thing that's really interesting is these characters all have this questioning over who they are, what their purpose is, what's the meaning of it all. And we see this questioning of what or who am I on the individual level, but also on the national level. And of course, the national is comprised of the individual. A nation cannot wonder, what am I? What is this nation? But those who comprise it certainly can. And that's what we're seeing. And so we're getting this overwhelming effect of a nation questioning itself, questioning what it is its identity. There's a brilliant episode at Prince Nikolai's dinner, page 600 in the bricks, where Count Rostopchin says, but how are we ever going to be able to fight the French? How can we take arms against our teachers and our idols? Look at our young men. Look at our ladies. The French are our gods, and Paris is our paradise. He began to raise his voice so that everyone could hear. Our fashions are French. Our ideas are French. Our feelings are French. And he says, oh dear me, when you look at our young people today, you feel like taking Peter the Great's old cudgel out of the museum and cracking a few ribs with it. Do it the Russian way. Now, talking about doing things the Russian way, let's talk briefly about divorce law in 19th century Russia. Let's talk about Andrei a little bit. why did he impose this test, this waiting period? Yes, that was his father's idea and he carried it out to appease his father. But he surely must have known that this would have been a very important way to save a lot of heartache later down the line if things were to go wrong, because you really didn't have a lot of wiggle room for things going wrong when it came to marriage back then. Was it really unfair of Andrei to impose this waiting period on Natasha? She's at this formative age, and surely a year apart, an absence, would mean that she won't be the same person at the end of it. But the thing is, Andrei has been through a lot himself, yeah? He has experience where Natasha does not, and he has a lot of pain where she does not. He's lost his first wife, and the death of a spouse or somebody very close to one is going to force one into a really miserable period of self-introspection, but also perhaps misanthropic reflection, the state of the world. And he's trying to be a realist, and perhaps we might think that he's bearing in mind the severity of the divorce laws at the time. In 19th century Russia, it was the Russian Orthodox Church and the Holy Synod that was in charge of granting divorce, and the reasons were obscure and strict and very, very hard to fulfill. For example, if one's partner was absent for 5 years, completely absent, didn't know where they were, didn't know if they were alive or dead, then the spouse would qualify for a divorce. Physical abuse, for example, was not a reason for divorce. You wouldn't be granted a divorce if that was your reason. And even adultery would have required multiple eyewitness accounts. Letters between lovers wouldn't have been enough to prove adultery. And so it was very, very hard to get divorced on the grounds of adultery too. Essentially, it was very, very hard once one was married to then get out of it. And so we can see why some of these characters are getting kind of cold feet around this idea of getting married. Oh, it's all wonderful when you're in high society and you have the balls and everybody looks really pretty and you only really know a person based on that particular face that they are presenting. But it might seem that Andrei is doing some due diligence. And whilst Andrei and Natasha drift apart or separate, we see the homing and the striving with Pierre and Natasha. And speaking of homing or striving, I continue to note the relentless movement in this book, not just across battlefields and drawing rooms, but as I've said, in inner movements, the ebbs and flows of the human soul. We see this across episodes, paragraphs, even single lines, and it's most certainly incredibly stark when we compare the beginning and the opening of specific episodes. So, for example, let's look at how Tolstoy crafts the opening of Part 5, Volume 2, and compare that to the ending of this part before we go into Volume 3. Page 588 in the Briggs, the opening of Part 5, we see the hallmarks of Tolstoic discontent are here. We're told that Pierre couldn't possibly go on living as before. This is almost like a stock phrase for Tolstoy's characters. They can't go on living as before. We saw this language in Tolstoy's Confession as well. We see language of former lives or one's former life. Pierre was shocked by the degree of disgust that he felt for that former life. We see talk of one's inner self. And of course we see ideas of fate and free will and eternity, in which Pierre felt that the way forward was set for him, marked out in advance for all eternity. And during this yearning to move forward, we also see a moving back. We see that Pierre, at the opening of Part 5, is now in old Russia. He's in Moscow. Pierre, who has been abroad and feels an outsider at home, and his outsider's perspective seems to ostracize him. That's something that I find very relatable. He looks around at society and he notes the hypocrisy of it all. We might wonder, of course, if we're utilizing some cognitive behavioural therapeutic techniques. We might question whether society could or even needs to be any other way, or should we expect it to be any other way? Yes, people are hypocritical, but Should they be any other way? Is it a fair expectation of people for them to not be hypocritical? He now feels a pull to Moscow, which he describes as warm and welcoming, and he describes it as being like putting on an old dressing gown. The Moscow ballrooms and the English club made him feel as though he had come back home to a haven of peace in Moscow. He felt warm and welcome, comfortable and scruffy. It was like putting on an old dressing gown. And we see that Pierre starts to drink, and alcohol comforts him and deludes him a little bit. So when he is sober, he wonders what's the meaning of it all. He hasn't got it all figured out. Who am I? What am I doing? What's the point? What is society? And then he drinks and suddenly he has all the answers, all the questions. I find this very relatable. Page 592, it was only after drinking a bottle or two of wine that he could vaguely accept that the horribly tangled skein of life, which had held such terrors for him, turned out to be less terrifying than he had imagined. Only under the influence of wine could he say to himself, there's nothing to it. I'll soon get that disentangled. Look, I've got the solution here. But now's not the time. I'll sort it out later. Except that later never came. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So we open this part 5, this last part of volume 2, and we end it with Pierre, and Pierre has changed yet again. And what a brilliant way to end volume 2 going into volume 3. We end with the great comet of 1812, yeah? We have found some incredible symbolism and imagery throughout War and Peace so far. And the comet. I love the comet. Let's read that passage together, because Tolstoy certainly knows how to end passages on symbolic cliffhangers. The great comet of 1812, that was an actual comet, by the way, and was actually first spotted in 1811. And the comet, of course, is pregnant with meaning, especially to Russians. Orlando Figes called 1812 the year that marked the beginning of the quest for Russian nationhood. And so whilst we see growth, movement and pain within the characters, we are also seeing it on the level of nations too, or the nation of Russia. So we get the grand and small in War and Peace. And the grand, of course, is comprised of the small. So we have talk of great men. Yes, great men are there, but Tolstoy's constant questioning is, what about the mass? What about humanity? The hive of humanity, or the swarm of humanity. If you notice recurring lexis drawn from the semantic field of beekeeping, that's because Tolstoy was an avid beekeeper at this time. Before we enjoy that comet passage, that last paragraph of volume 2 together, here's Rosamund Bartlett talking about Tolstoy's interest in bees. After he got married, Tolstoy became passionately interested in bees. He bought some hives from Sonia's grandfather and installed them in a distant part of the estate, about a mile from the family home in the lime and aspen wood beyond the Voronka River. Sonia tried and failed to share this passion as well, as she later wrote in her autobiography. The whole of his passionate nature was revealed in this enthusiasm. Tolstoy developed enthusiasms for the most diverse things throughout his life. Games, music, ancient Greek, schools, Japanese pigs, pedagogy, horses, hunting, too many, in fact, to count. And that's not including his intellectual and literary interests. They were most extreme. He was madly passionate about everything at the height of his enthusiasm. And if he could not convince whomever he was talking to of the importance of the activity he was caught up in, he was capable of being even hostile to that person. And Sonia became quite lonely. During the early summer of 1863, her husband spent whole days with his bees. She walked through the fields to take him his lunch or a glass of tea in the evening, and would find him with a net over his head, arranging the combs in a hive or capturing a swarm. After sitting there and getting stung, she would face a solitary walk back home. As well as reading about beekeeping, Tolstoy spent hours observing the patterns of behaviour of his bees, assisted by his beekeeper. During the summer, his absorption with the Yasnaya Polyana apiary abated after about 2 years, but his enthusiasm for beekeeping left its mark in his writing. Firstly, there's the famous epic simile in War and Peace, borrowed from Virgil's Aeneid, in which Moscow in 1812 is compared to a queenless hive. Conversely, Tolstoy thought of a busy hive when conveying the atmosphere of the ball in Anna Karenina, and a little later in the novel he describes bees on their first spring flight after the relocation of their hive for the summer. The precision of his vocabulary, often overlooked by most translators, tells us a great deal about the rigour he applied to his study of apiculture. So it might be interesting to think and introspect and try to figure out why exactly Tolstoy was so fascinated by bees, and why did he find it relevant to use a hive, a swarm, as a parallel for humanity. What does that say about how Tolstoy views humanity? What do you think? But let's talk about the symbolism of the comet. Constant comparisons are being made between 2 years that are stuck in a ground as a yardstick, as a measurement. We have 1805 and we have 1812. We have Austerlitz and we have Borodino, which is on the horizon. In that time period, from between 1805 to 1812, Russia and Europe has changed, and the people have changed. And if we think what our own lives looked like 7 years back, in a time that isn't as turbulent as the Napoleonic era, think for a moment what your life looked like 7 years ago. Think of the specific year that would be. At time of recording, that would be 2016. And when you say the year 2016, you most likely have specific world events that come back to you, and personal events too. Saying a year means something. Heaven knows that if we say 2020 in many years to come, that will mean something. And this current year, at time of recording, 2023, can you imagine taking a bird's eye view? Can you imagine being several decades on, 50 years on? What would characterise 2023? What would be the events? What would be the personal events that would come back to us? One thing is for sure, when we summon our own personal history and history generally, there is a lot of retrospective arrangement going on, to deploy a Joycean term, or a term that we picked up from reading Joyce's Ulysses. And that means that very often meaning is loaded retrospectively. And so we have this comet described. And again, keep in mind at time of recording, we are being told to look out for a green comet that should be visible to the naked eye. It should be coming across the sky during the month of February and I believe early March 2023. But this comet meant something when people saw it, and it meant even more retrospectively, upon reflection. And so if that's true, if meaning is loaded retrospectively, then what are the implications for history, historians? What comment is Tolstoy keen to make? And we'll see that Tolstoy is most certainly keen to make many comments about historians. And we might wonder, how does one's personal interpretation of events and things we see, how does it change from the moment when we first experience it or witness it and later down the line? However, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to comments, they have long had ominous connotations. They've very frequently been seen since records began as omens of doom. Indeed, the most famous comet, Halley's Comet, was thought to be an omen for the Battle of Hastings. And comets have very frequently been interpreted as a sign of a king's death or the fall of a nation. Here's a little passage on the comet from Adam Zamoyski's 1812 Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow, which I highly recommend as a supplementary resource. It's very, very good. On the evening of the 25th of March 1811, as he was scouring the night sky from his makeshift observatory in Viviers, Andrei discovered a comet in the now defunct constellation of Argo Navis. He saw it again the following day and began to track its progress. The comet was low in the south and was moving northward and brightening. On the 11th of April, it was spotted again, and then again on the 12th of May. The comet soon became visible to the naked eye, and by the late autumn, it lit up the night sky from Lisbon to Moscow. People gazed up at it, some with interest, many more with a sense of foreboding. This seemed to increase the further east one went in Europe. As they contemplated the brilliant comet of 1811, recalled a parish priest, the people of Lithuania prepared themselves for some extraordinary event. Another inhabitant of the province never forgot how everyone got up from dinner and went out to gaze on the comet and then talk of famine, fire, war and bloodshed. In Russia, many linked the comet to a plague of fires which swept the land that summer and autumn, and a blind terror gripped them as they looked on it. I remember fixing a long look on it on an autumn moonless night, and I was struck with childlike fear, wrote the son of a Russian landowner. Its long bright tail, which seemed to wave with the movement of the wind and to leap from time to time, filled me with such horror that in the days that followed, I did not look up at the sky at night until the comet had disappeared. Now, when Pierre sees the comet on page 663 in the Briggs, it's a really beautiful passage. We're told it was clear and frosty. A dark, starlit heaven looked down on the black roofs and the dirty, dusky streets. Now, keep in mind the timing of this. What has just happened at this point in the narrative? Well, Pierre is going to look at this comet post-love confession of sorts. He's revealed that he has feelings for Natasha. Keep in mind as well that the meaning we derive from the natural world changes as we accrue experience, as we continue to live. We've already seen that with Andrei and the mighty oak tree. We're told that only by looking up at the sky could Pierre distance himself from the disgusting squalor of all earthly things as compared with the heights to which his soul had now been taken. And we're told that a vast firmament of darkness and stars opened out before Pierre's eyes. And we see a scattering of stars on every side, but catching the eye through its closeness to the earth, its pure white light, and the long uplift of its tail, shone the comet. The huge, brilliant comet of 1812, that popular harbinger of untold horrors and the end of the world. But this bright comet with its long, shiny tail held no fears for Pierre. Quite the reverse. Pierre's eyes glittered with tears of rapture as he gazed up at this radiant star, which must have traced its parabola through infinite space at speeds unimaginable, and now suddenly seemed to have picked its spot in the black sky and impaled itself like an arrow, piercing the earth and stuck there. With its strong upthrusting tail and its brilliant display of whiteness amidst the infinity of scintillating stars, this heavenly body seemed perfectly attuned to Pierre's newly melted heart as it gathered reassurance and blossomed into new life. New life. Those are the last words of this volume. We began with a discontented Pierre, and now we have new life blossoming as he looks up at this symbol that should be a harbinger of doom. But as those of us who are interested in tarot will know, if you turn over the death card, for example, it's not always a bad thing, yeah? Because death is also a rebirth or a chance to be reborn. But we'll see that understanding will come later. Interpretation of symbolism can take some time. So this could be seen as a harbinger of war. It could be seen as representing emerging national identity. But we could say for Pierre, it symbolises a love for Natasha and the growth of his soul. Now let's talk about a section that is responsible for giving Tolstoy the reputation as a moralising anti-historian. It's a really interesting jump from volume 2 to volume 3. And it's worth keeping in mind this idea of estrangement or defamiliarisation, because many readers have a problem with Tolstoy taking a step back and being really overt, and it feels like the story is fractured or split off. It really makes you aware of the story, of War and Peace as a sort of physical entity. It's like throwing a spanner in the works, isn't it? But that's brilliant. In my opinion, that's genius, or that's part of Tolstoy's genius, is to have us completely immersed in the story, yeah, and swept up in these fictional characters' dilemmas, and then to yank us out of it. That jarring jump, I think, is deliberate and deployed to great effect. And Tolstoy loves to do jumps, jarring jumps. Sometimes he'll do that to create comedy or irony, or he'll make a satirical comment on society, and sometimes here he wants us to really think about what he's saying, and one certainly couldn't argue that Tolstoy is forgettable or his message is forgettable. It's not. So he's met his aim, hasn't he? And so at the end of the previous volume, we have this character, a fictional character contemplating a very real comet that did happen and seeing it as a symbol. And we could be reading a romance for all we know. We're thoroughly swept up in it. And then Tolstoy proceeds with an essay on history and a huge heaping of his own authorial intrusion. It disrupts our reading immersion, it disrupts the flow, and it makes us all too aware of what we are reading. But Tolstoy is constantly estranging and defamiliarising. And I think that's also part of the rationale behind the French passages, the huge blocks of French. That makes it harder to read. Maybe some people can switch effortlessly between Russian and French or English and French, but it's noticeable, it's jarring, it's not there for flow or immersion for the large majority of readers. And those who do not have French, they either have to consult the footnotes or they have to be lucky enough to be reading in an era where we have a fantastic translation like the one from Anthony Briggs that essentially removes the French. Now, even though that French is removed, we still are really aware of it, or at least I am, because Briggs is constantly saying he spoke in French. His speech was broken because it was French. It came through with like the inflection of French. It's always in French, in French, in French. We're aware that they're switching. And that alone, maybe not as much as having the full actual passage in French, but that alone kind of makes us stop a little bit, doesn't it? And that's the point. Tolstoy does not want us to be fully immersed all of the time. And indeed, we might say that how Tolstoy deploys onomatopoeia could be estranging as well. I think of what Richard Pierre said in his introduction to the vintage paperback edition, with that passage where drops dripped. The fact is, it's so uncanny, or it's so realistic, that we are, ironically, forced to contemplate the fact that it is a construct. It's like looking at a painting and marvelling at the attention to detail and then realising, hey, this is a painting. Another way that Tolstoy manages to defamiliarise is with his historical personages. In the third volume, Napoleon really becomes a character. And it's really odd to see a historical figure humanised. It feels wrong almost, doesn't it? And what I mean by wrong is it feels almost like it's poorly rendered, and yet it's not. It's really, really accurate. Even those passages where Napoleon is speaking and we see his dialogue, we might question it and think, did he really say this? But if you consult historical accounts, you'll see that Tolstoy's attention to detail is extraordinary. Yeah, he really did say it. And the descriptions are very, very apt. And yet, because he has such an aura around him, the man has become something of a legend, and we're used to seeing him in paintings. It doesn't feel real, does it? But the irony is that he's kind of the most real, ostensibly or objectively, because he actually did exist, but he's also the least real. And this is subservient to Tolstoy's argument that great men are the slaves of history, or kings are the slaves of history, and the fictional characters have something much more truthful in them, and we might think have more scope or more of a range when it comes to will, when it comes to freedom. We get these external descriptions of Napoleon, and then we can see into his interiority, and that feels strange. And then in chapter 6 of volume 3, this is page 684 in the Briggs, we actually smell Napoleon. In the ensuing silence, someone else could be heard moving about in the study with a firm and resolute tread. Napoleon. He had just finished dressing for his ride and was wearing a blue uniform, open over a white waistcoat, which covered his round belly. High boots and white doeskin breeches stretched tightly over fat thighs and stumpy legs. Notice that Tolstoy is describing the visual. This is like ekphrasis, yeah? And then the estrangement will come when we get the olfactory, yeah? When we get a sense of smell thrown in. It's almost like we're looking at a painting and we can assimilate that. But what art gives us an actual smell? His short hair looked as if it had just been brushed, but one lock had been left curling down in the middle of his broad forehead. His plump white neck stood out sharply against the black collar of his uniform. So far, seems all right, seems what we would expect of Napoleon, because what we have been exposed to thus far, most of our lives when it comes to this figure, is painting, visual representation. And then we're told he smelt of eau de cologne. His full, young-looking face with its prominent chin shone with the graciousness of a monarch, welcoming a visitor with regal splendour. And then the description of his walking is brilliant. He emerged from the study at a quick pace, wobbling as he walked, with his head tilted slightly back, the whole of his tubby, dumpy figure, with his broad fat shoulders and his chest and belly sticking out, whether he liked it or not, had the impressive stateliness of a 40-year-old used to his creature comforts. It's interesting, so if we feel as though Napoleon's representation is strange, that's made all the more strange by how at home we feel when we return to the fictional characters. We get a great contrast with Andrei, when we're back to Andrei, who back in Bald Hills sees that everything is exactly as it had always been. Life was going on exactly as it always had done, page 694, down to the last detail. He drove up the avenue to the stone gates of the house like someone approaching a castle, sleeping under an enchanter's spell. I love Tolstoy's metaphors. It was all as staid as ever, with the same cleanliness. Notice the repetition. Same cleanliness, the same silence about the house, the same furnishings, the same walls, the same sounds, the same smell, and the same timid faces, just a little older. Princess Maria was just the same, plain and timid girl, beginning to show her age. We might question, well, is everything really the same? And we see that much of what Tolstoy is keen to emphasise overtly is hit upon from different angles from the characters. Different angles, yeah, so it's all about perspective. We see that Maria tells Andrei, page 697, she says, I understand you. You mustn't think sorrow is the work of men. She says men are his instruments. Sorrow is sent by him and not by men. Men are his instruments. The fault is not theirs. If you think someone has done you wrong, you must forgive and forget. We have no right to punish others, and you will know the joy of forgiveness. It might be interesting to contemplate that forgiveness does come with very real joy, maybe not joy, but relief. Forgiveness is not really for the forgiven party. It's for the forgiver. That's the person who gets the most benefit. If you can forgive somebody, first you understand them, then you forgive them, then a weight is lifted from your shoulders. Because if you hold a grudge, well, think about the language we use. Hold a grudge, bear a grudge or a burden. Spiritual problems manifest in the body. We don't want to be holding things, yeah, always holding things, always tense, carrying things around with us. We talk about having baggage. I've got baggage. And then we also talk about letting go. Let go of the baggage. She tells her brother, remember, sorrows come from God and men are never to blame. The opening of part 3 is extraordinary because we are getting to grips with Tolstoy's propositions, yeah, what he is proposing when it comes to history. And indeed, every single work of great literature gives you something different, yeah? It gives you spiritual and emotional nourishment, it helps you grow, and we reread these great books over the course of our lives because by virtue of our having changed, we will see different things and we'll be able to get new wisdom from these books. It's really interesting. If you mark your books and then return to your marked copy years later, you'll be able to notice your own growth. So when you're marking your books, you're marking your growth. I did this recently when I returned to my old battered copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, yeah, and noticing what maxims I marked years ago. And I realised I don't need those maxims right now, or I don't gravitate towards them. What I need to hear is a little bit different. And we can do this with the great books, but not only do the great books give us spiritual nourishment, they also can be leveraged into an appreciation of different modes, different forms. And we can give ourselves ever-expanding assignments. And very frequently, the thing that we can get from a book is that which we most resist. And it's interesting because many readers will resist the historical side, or they'll resist how heavy-handed Tolstoy is, but maybe that resistance is a key, a tip-off to where we should go. And so the gift that Tolstoy wants to give us is the gift of history. Regardless of what he has to say about historians, in the opening of this part, he talks about historians in their simple-minded certitude, but he's giving us the gift of historical understanding, regardless. But how do you read history? Well, the first thing that's worth keeping in mind is you need more than one source. And during our journey through Tolstoy's War and Peace, we've been taking little side avenues. Many of us have been watching documentaries, learning about Napoleon, and that's been really rewarding. And Mortimer Adler would be very happy to see that we're doing that. Here's Adler talking about how to read history specifically. Because theories of history differ, and because a historian's theory affects his account of events, it is necessary to read more than one account of the history of an event or period if we want to understand it. Indeed, this is the first rule of reading history. Okay, so that's rule number one. Have multiple sources. And then what you want to do is cross-examine your sources by exhaustively checking them against one another. And as you're doing this, what you want to keep in mind that any good history is also universal. So the universal is in the individual, and learning about the Napoleonic era has many things to tell us about our own era. As Adler says, we read a history not only to learn what really happened at a particular time and place in the past, but also to learn the way men act in all times and places, especially now. And that's what fiction can give us. It can give us truth that transcends ostensible fact. Ostensible facts are very often clouded by interpretation. So what Tolstoy is imploring us to do is to see as many angles as possible and see what is behind these facts, the universal truth behind them. And Adler implores us to keep in mind the question, what of it? First, we need to understand what's happening, what the events in question are, and then we must ask ourselves, what of it? What does it mean? Why does it matter? Yeah? And the conclusion that Adler seems to come to is so that many devastating effects do not happen again. We have that old adage of, if we do not know history, we are doomed to repeat it. Yeah? And Tolstoy, he tells us in chapter 1, part 1 of volume 3, the latter part of 1811 saw a build-up in the concentration and arming of troops in Western Europe, and in 1812 these forces, millions of men, moved from west to east, closing in on the frontiers of Russia. On the 12th of June, the forces of Western Europe crossed the Russian frontier and war began. In other words, an event took place which defied human reason and all human nature. Millions of men set out to inflict on one another untold evils, deception, treachery, robbery, forgery, counterfeiting, theft, arson and murder on a scale unheard of in the annals of law courts and down the centuries and all over the world. Though at the time, the men responsible did not think of these deeds as crimes. And he asks, what were the causes behind this? Well, historians in their simple-minded certitude might tell us that diplomacy failed, diplomatic endeavours failed, and they'll try to assign blame to different things that happened, different singular causes. But Tolstoy says we can well understand how these and other causes, endless in number, infinite in their proliferation because of the endless points of view available, might have appeared to contemporaries. But for us, the descendants of these people, these explanations seem inadequate. And then he says it's beyond our comprehension that millions of Christian men should have killed and tortured each other just because Napoleon was a megalomaniac, yeah? Just because, is that the reason, that's the cause? Just because Alexander was obstinate? Just because the English were devious and the Duke of Oldenburg was badly done by? We can see no connection between these circumstances and the stark reality of murder and violence. And the more deeply we go into causes, Tolstoy says, the more of them there are. Yeah, we mustn't be reductive and say it was because of this and this and this. We want things to be neatly packaged like that, but it's not true. And if we examine our day-to-day lives, we see that so many things go in to how our lives turn out. There isn't a single cause. And we get a procession of ifs, conditionals. If Napoleon hadn't done this, then there would have been no war. But if every large sergeant had refused to go back into the army, then there wouldn't have been a war. And if this, then that. If this, then that. But these events had no single cause, being bound to happen simply because they were bound to happen. And millions of men abandoned all human reason and feeling and marched to slay their brothers. And Tolstoy tells us brilliantly that every man has two lives, or there are two sides to every individual. We have the personal life and the elemental life. Each man lives for himself, using his freedom to get what he wants, and he feels with every fibre of his being that at any particular time he is free to perform an action or refrain from doing so. But the moment any action is taken, it becomes an irrevocable piece of history, with a significance which has more to do with predetermination than freedom. There are two sides for every individual: a personal life, in which his freedom exists in proportion to the abstract nature of his interests, and an elemental life within the swarm of humanity, in which a man inevitably follows laws laid down for him. So we've got this brilliant idea of the moment an act is committed, it's now committed to history. And those of us who have enjoyed Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian may recall some of what Judge Holden said, some of his lectures as they wandered through the desert. And then we get this brilliant phrase, which could be a philosophical maxim. And if we just had this line alone, we'd have to think endlessly in trying to determine how the writer got there. But Tolstoy, of course, exhaustively tells us how he got there. The maxim is this: kings are the slaves of history. Seems like a strange irony, doesn't it? Kings are the slaves of history, but he tells us that the higher a man stands on the social scale, the more contact he has with other men and the greater his impact on them, the more obvious are the inevitability and the element of predestination involved in everything he does. Kings are the slaves of history. Now, Maria has said it in a bit of a different way. She's said it coming from a much more overtly Christian angle, and she's told her brother that men are his instruments. We're the instruments of God, the instruments of the divine. And Tolstoy says, kings are the slaves of history, and history is an amorphous, unconscious life within the swarm of humanity. And history exploits every minute in the lives of kings as an instrument for the attainment of its own ends. When it comes to events in history, so-called great men are nothing but labels attached to events. Like real labels, they have the least possible connection with events themselves. Every action they perform, which they take to be self-determined and independent, is in a historical sense quite the opposite. It is interconnected with the whole course of history and predetermined from eternity. And though Tolstoy is keen to make these sweeping, broad statements about historical fatalism, he's keen to show us the hive as a whole and history as an amorphous, unconscious monster of sorts. He also goes into the hive and shows us the individual bees who have a very rich inner life. We get these different factions that are diametrically opposed to one another when it comes to the war, and depending on what their interest is, we get these men pontificating and theorizing about war, the scientific aspect of war. And we see that one of our bees, Andrei, takes this endless theorizing to task. Chapter 11, page 711. What kind of theory, he asks, and science can there be when conditions and circumstances are indeterminate and can never be defined, and the active strengths of the warring parties are even more indefinable? He says one person proposes this, another person proposes that. All of these propositions are equally good and bad, and the advantages of any one proposition will only become clear after the event. So why all this talk about military genius? Yeah, this person's a genius, this person's a genius. What about Bonaparte's genius? Would this be as resonant coming from Andrei if these thoughts had not already been hammered home relentlessly by Tolstoy? I think not. But we won't know because we haven't had the exposure to the story without those historical essays. It'd be interesting to know what the effect would have been. I think it would have been quite a bit more subtle. So we can theorise endlessly, but it's only after the event that propositions will become clear. And another bee in the hive is, of course, Natasha. We see that she's maturing, and we see that many of Tolstoy's characters could have used being born into a time where there was much more mental health awareness. She's struggling, suffering from the fallout of her disintegrated relationship with Andrei, and we see that she starts to develop stronger religious feeling. We get this brilliant scene where they're praying in the church, and they're praying for the vanquishing of their enemies. And in Natasha's interiority, she says brilliantly to herself that it doesn't seem to line up with Christian feeling. One moment we're praying for our neighbours, we're trying to love our neighbours, and then we're praying that we we can kill them in warfare. And marvellously, she just ends up in her mind praying for everybody. Page 734 to 735. She couldn't pray for her enemies to be trampled underfoot when only a few minutes earlier she had been wishing for more enemies to love and pray for. And notice the timing, the temporality. Tolstoy is constantly pulling in eternity. We have Pierre wondering about the significance of events that are barely anything on the scale of eternity. And here, in these moments, one moment I'm praying for my neighbours, then I'm praying that we can vanquish them. That's almost like the macro on the micro level, isn't it? Because we can see that within the broad sweeps of history too. If years become seconds, or even smaller slices of time when we think about eternity. Yet she couldn't doubt the righteousness of the prayer recited by the priest on his knees. She felt a thrill of dread at the awesome punishments due to be meted out to mankind for its sins, especially her sins. And she prayed that everyone should be forgiven, including her, and that she and everybody else should enjoy peace and happiness in their lives. And it seemed to her that God heard her prayer. And we see another bee in the hive. We see Nikolai. And he is really learning the reality of war, both in terms of cowardice and courage. He's seen both ends of the spectrum. Earlier in the narrative, he's learnt about cowardice and how we might actually act when faced with the heat of battle. Why are these men trying to kill me? Why do they hate me? Everybody loves me. And then in this section, we see that he learns that courage isn't all it's cracked up to be either. He's given a medal for his valour, but when he's confronted with the French officer, his foe, he sees that this man who's supposed to be his enemy was terrified, wincing from immediate expectation of another blow. This is chapter 15, page 723, and he looked up at Rostov, recoiling in horror, this pale, mud-stained face of a fair-haired young man with a dimple on his chin and bright blue eyes. Notice the details. It really humanises this man, doesn't it? The specificity of it. This man had no business with battlefields. It was not the face of an enemy. It was a domestic, indoor face. Tolstoy really gives us such a nuanced depiction of warfare, doesn't he? And then towards the end of the first part of volume 3, we see again the idea or the theme of interpretation, and we only really understand things after the fact, but Pierre is trying to divine things, and he's also trying to search for meaning, and we see that when he interprets Napoleon, and he reads a prophecy concerning Napoleon, and he even aligns the emperor's names with the letters 666. And not only that, but with a little bit of heavy-handedness, we see that he gets his own name wrapped up in the mix. So he thinks his destiny to be bound up, intertwined, linked with Napoleon. Page 737, how and by what means he was connected with the great event predicted in the apocalypse, he couldn't tell. But the connection was there beyond doubt. It was all there. His love for Natasha, the Antichrist, Napoleon's invasion, the comet, the number 666. For me, however, my favourite part from this section is not so much Tolstoy's ponderings on history, it's not so much how the characters, the individual bees in the hive, try to divine their destiny, but it's Pierre's meditation on heavenly love that we get at the beginning of chapter 19 in volume 3. I think this is one of the most beautiful meditations on love that I've ever read in literature, so I would like to end today's discussion here. Ever since the day Pierre had driven home from the Rostovs, with Natasha's look of gratitude still fresh in his mind, stared up at the comet in the sky, and felt the range of new possibilities opening up before him, he had stopped worrying about the agonising problem of the vanity and senselessness of all earthly things, the terrible questions. Why? What's it all about? Which had always assailed him, whatever he was doing, had now been replaced, not by different questions or answers to the old ones, but by an image of her. If he heard people prattling on about nothing, or did so himself, if he read or heard about something that reminded him of human wickedness or folly, he no longer despaired. He had stopped wondering why people bothered with anything at all when life was so short and uncertain. He had only to think of her as he had last seen her, and all his doubts melted away. Not because she had any answers to the questions that had been haunting him, but because her image transported him instantly into another realm of sweetness, light and active spirituality, where there was no question of being in the right or in the wrong, a region of beauty and love well worth living for. If he came across some worldly abomination, he would say to himself, so-and-so's robbing the state and the Tsar. While the state and the Tsar weigh him down with honours, is he? Well, let him get on with it. She smiled at me yesterday. She asked me round, and I love her. And nobody will ever know. So I'm going to leave it there for today, and our next discussion will cover Volume 3, Part 2, which will take us up to page 910 in the Briggs. We're really getting through this book, aren't we? And do let us know what you're making of War and Peace so far. And for those of you who are interested in appreciating some of Tolstoy's shorter works, his short fiction, you might be interested to know that I'm currently working on a podcast which will cover one of my favourite stories, and that is How Much Land Does a Man Need?, which is available in slim little penguin black classics edition. This is a supplementary, optional bit of reading that you might be interested to explore. But our next discussion will take us up to page 910 in War and Peace. Let us know what you made of these parts of the book. How are you feeling about Tolstoy's masterpiece this far into the work? Indeed, would you call it a masterpiece? Let us know what's been resonating with you. And thank you so much for reading along. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a lovely day, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.